All right, it's now 2 p.m., so we will go ahead and get started. Good afternoon and welcome to the next installment in our webinar series, Unpacking PREA, the North Carolina Approach to Victim Services Behind Bars. Today's webinar is titled PREA Reporting Options Explained. Next slide. My name is Gabriella Nyman, the Training and Communication Specialist with NC CASA, and I will be your moderator for today's webinar. Before we start our webinar, here's some basic information about NC CASA. We are an inclusive statewide alliance working to end sexual violence through education, advocacy, and legislation. We use the social justice framework, therefore our work is done from a strong intersectional social justice perspective. By centering our work around marginalized communities, everyone is served. Some of our work includes the Training Institute, including our online learning module, supporting rape crisis centers, resource sharing and technical assistance, legislative and policy work, anti-human trafficking outreach, prevention education, working with colleges and universities, and providing access to language services. Next slide. Before we begin, I want to go over some webinar logistics. We are using Zoom webinar for the webinar series. For those of you who joined us on other webinars, you should be familiar with how Zoom webinars work. But just in case, I want to do a quick review. All participants are muted throughout. Please enter any discussion responses in chat box at the bottom of your screen as shown in the slide. You can submit a question in the Q&A button. We will have time for questions at the end, but feel free to ask them at any time. I will be keeping an eye on them throughout. We will have a few polls to engage you throughout the presentation. These will be shown on your screen and you will be able to enter your response. The webinar will be recorded. A recording will be posted on the NC CASA website and YouTube in the coming days, along with resources mentioned in this webinar. If you have trouble with Zoom, please email me at gabriella@nccasa.org. Today's webinar is the fourth in the series of 8. Altogether, these webinars replicate in-person trainings we have held throughout North Carolina and support NC CASA's work around the state to build strong, lasting relationships between victim advocacy organizations and local jails. If you missed one of the earlier webinars or are unable to join a future webinar, don't worry, they can be all found on NC CASA's website. Today, our presenters talk about the PREA reporting standards and confidentiality related to victim services. Next week, we will have the first of 2-part webinar focused on at-risk populations in confinement for sexual victimization. The second part to that 2-part webinar will come just after the 4th of July, after which we will have 2 final webinars to round out the series, and we hope that you will be able to join us. More specifically, the objectives for today's webinar include define what is meant by confidentiality of victim support services, describe the role of victim advocates, understand what is meant by internal and external reporting options, differentiate between external and third-party reporting. I would like to introduce Tara Graham, she, her, hers, Senior Program Director at Just Detention International. Tara spent nearly 14 years working on the development and implementation of the PREA standards. Lisa Cook, she, her, hers, jail consultant for NC CASA. Lisa is the former Buncombe County Jail PREA coordinator and was a DOJ certified PREA auditor. In her work with NC CASA, she assists in creating trainings in partnership with NC CASA and other agencies. She is the co-author of the North Carolina Approach, creating and navigating new relationships to better serve incarcerated survivors of sexual assault, a resource we will introduce in the webinar series. I will go ahead and hand over the webinar to Tara.
Great, thank you, Gabriella. Just Detention International is pleased to partner with NC CASA to bring you these webinars. JDI is a health and human rights organization that seeks to end sexual abuse in all forms of detention. For those of you that have joined us on previous webinars, you know that JDI carries out its mission through multiple strategies. We do this by working with corrections officials, rape crisis advocates, and policymakers to make detention facilities safe. by promoting public attitudes that value the dignity and safety of people in detention, and by supporting incarcerated survivors of sexual abuse and sexual harassment. At JDI, our core guiding principle is that no matter what crime a person has committed, a rape is not part of the penalty. Today, we will talk about reporting cultures and why people choose not to report sexual abuse. Our goal is to create places where people will report to get the help and support they need to heal and to prevent future incidents from occurring. We will talk about sexual violence and hear from a survivor. Please practice self-care. That is, pay attention to how the information is affecting you. Or if you need to step away while a video plays, please do so. It is important to know that when you need a break or need to step away from the information you may find upsetting. To get things started, we're curious about who's joining us today. So Gabriella is going to launch a poll for everyone, and then please answer your response on the slide or on your screen. So tell us where you work. Do you work for a rape crisis center or such as a sexual assault or domestic violence center? Do you work for another advocacy related organization such as mental health, reentry, or medical? Are you from a North Carolina jail, a North Carolina prison, or maybe another criminal justice entity? So if you can take a moment to please indicate that for us. Please make sure that you indicate on the screen. I know some folks are putting in chat. That way it'll help count up the number of people who are responding.
So it looks like we have 20 out of 38 people have responded so far. So I'm going to give it another 15 seconds before I end the poll.
That sounds great.
All right, so it looks like 71% work at a rape crisis center, SADV center, 16% other advocacy related organizations, 6% jail, 0% prison, and 6% other criminal justice entity.
Great, thank you so much for that, Gabriella. For those of you who are from corrections facilities, we want to hear a little bit more from you, as well as from advocates. So while we just had a poll, now we're going to actually have you use the chat function to give us your responses. So for those of you, and I know we only have a couple that are from a corrections facility or another criminal justice agency, how do you encourage reporting of things that happen in a confinement setting? And then I'd also like to take a minute for advocates that are with us today to think about how they play a role in promoting an environment where prisoners and staff are able to report sexual abuse safely. So what role could you play? So if you could take a moment and add your thoughts to the chat box, then Gabriella will share those with the larger group. So again, for those of you from corrections or criminal justice, how do you encourage reporting? Creating a reporting culture in facilities. And then for advocates, how do you promote and encourage people to make reports of sexual abuse?
So one response is we have our confidential crisis line as a means of reporting.
Okay, and we'll give a couple of seconds in case others want to chime in.
Another response, ongoing education for inmates and ongoing training for staff to create an open environment for reporting. Another one, keeping Marines aware of the resources around us through training. Another one, at our detention center, we speak with each inmate during intake to make them aware on how to report. Another one, resident education, to report to correctional staff, contract providers, and medical.
Great, thank you. I hear a lot of corrections folks chiming in here, which is great, and talking about education. That is absolutely, one way to, encourage a reporting culture. And I like that was mentioned that it's not just about education of the inmates or prisoners, but it's also education of the staff as well to encourage reporting cultures. Oh, there's one more coming in here. I'll go ahead and read it, Gabrielle. It says also training for corrections staff, having a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week crisis line available, displaying info on the jail common areas for inmates to see, and a call for info and support. Great. So a lot of education, making sure information is readily available. And as we go through today's webinar, we will look at reasons why people don't report, and just to put into your mind about how work as advocates or work in corrections, how you can kind of counteract reasons why people may not report. So to get things started, we're actually going to hear first from Rodney Roussel, a survivor of sexual abuse and confinement and a member of JDI's Survivor Council. JDI has a Survivor Council where we partner with survivors of sexual abuse and confinement. And they are often, many like Rodney, willing to give of their story and share publicly what has happened to them in a way to raise awareness and also to keep working towards preventing of sexual violence in confinement settings. So I want you to take a moment to listen about what Rodney shares about staff responses to his reports of sexual abuse. And I'll go ahead and launch this video. I do want to mention it does talk about sexual violence. So if that's bothersome for you, feel free to take a moment and step away. The video is about, I think it's about 5 minutes long. So just a moment and I will share the video with everyone.
I'd never been in jail before. I had never been in any type of incarcerated environment. The holding cell felt like it was supposed to hold maybe about 10 to 15 people at the most, and there were about 30 or 40 if I can estimate. A guy comes and sits next to me and puts his arm around me, and I don't say anything, but I'm just like, what is this about? And so he says, "Oh, don't be like that, sweetness." And so I generally look around the holding cell to see if, kind of say with my eyes, in a sense, this is wrong. Somebody stop this. There was never a situation where I had, at that point, a staff that I could have went to and said, something's wrong here. Going to a staff or an officer at that point would have probably been the end of my life. Always between me and an officer was an inmate. The one thing that could have changed this story for me was staff just pulling me aside and asking me if I'm all right. She would come around and she would make rounds and she would see, she would ask who, what's going on, how y'all doing, what y'all, so she was in tune with what was going on in the prison. Anyone that was trying to perpetrate anything knew not to try it with her because she understood how this ran. And usually on her shift, nothing really happened. So yeah, I felt safe. Federal Bureau of Prisons put together a very, very nice, a good step forward as far as making the prisoners and staff aware of PREA. It's not being pro-inmate or either pro-staff. It's just being pro-right. No one deserves for their body, their mind, their sexuality. No one deserves that to be ripped from them because they committed a crime.
I just want to thank Rodney for that, for sharing his story. Let me now go back to sharing the PowerPoint. Okay, so hopefully folks are able to see the PowerPoint. And I just want to take a moment to have people reflect upon what Rodney shared. So think about what he shared about the different locations and staff responses to his reports. What are your reactions to what he had to share? Please take a moment and add your thoughts to the chat box.
So we have a response. I'm so happy he was moved where a staff member truly cared. Another response, concerning but not surprising.
Okay, and we'll take a moment to see if anyone else wants to add any responses or any comments, and then we'll keep going forward. Okay, so people feel free if you would like to continue to add comments. We will be asking for you to contribute other thoughts as we go through the webinar today. And of course, as Gabriella said at the top of the webinar, if you have any questions for us as presenters, please add those in the Q&A box and we will address those either throughout the webinar or certainly at the Q&A section at the end. So as we've talked about in other webinars, based on federal surveys of individuals in prisons and jails, it is estimated that 200,000 people a year experience sexual abuse in confinement. This in and of itself is shocking. Even one person being sexually abused is too many. Of this 200,000, just over 8,700 filed report. That's only about 4% of all the incidents of sexual abuse were formally reported. This was determined by comparing administrative data submitted to the federal government about the incidents against those surveys that were done of those who were incarcerated. As with sexual abuse in the community, it is a crime that is severely underreported. Of the reports that were made, just under 1,000 were substantiated or proven to have occurred. Many, if not most of sexual abuse incidents in confinement, especially between inmates, are found to be unsubstantiated. That is, there was not enough evidence to prove or disprove that the incident occurred. These investigations are very difficult and it's not uncommon to have scant evidence. Before we move on, I'd love to hear from those corrections officials that are joining us today. I know that you want people to report when something has happened. If you could, take a moment to share in the chat about why you want to know. How does knowing about an incident of sexual abuse help you in your work? So again, take a moment in the chat box, those of you from corrections, and tell us why you want to know that something has occurred in your facility. We'll give folks another minute. So I'll keep an eye on the chat box. It looks like folks may be a little bit shy to respond today, but please feel free to add your chats or comments as we go. I mean, I will say, oh, thank you, Melinda. You know, Melinda says that a response to sexual abuse is very important. And I know from talking with folks in corrections and working in various jurisdictions is they want to keep people safe, that people in confinement, you know, they not only want to address what's happening to a single individual, but they also want to determine if it's something that's more systemic, if more people are being sexually assaulted, and they want to put an end to that as well. So it's critical for them, for safety and security of the facility, that know something has happened. So one of the things, oh, I'm sorry, and Erin says it helps the alleged victim. It helps staff identify areas of the facility that may be problem areas, and it helps other inmates see staff take all reports seriously. Yeah, thank you, Erin. That's really, really critical, both of those points, especially about staff taking all reports seriously. Thank you for that. So I want to share for a minute about why people don't make a report of sexual abuse in confinement. These survivors face many of the same barriers to reporting or seeking help as survivors in the community. According to a Bureau of Justice Statistics, or BJS study, many incarcerated survivors did not want anyone to know about the sexual abuse due to feelings of embarrassment or shame. Furthermore, BJS data showed that survivors may keep quiet out of fear of punishment, like isolation, including placement in solitary confinement or the loss of good time or programming, because of retaliation and re-victimization by the perpetrator or friends of the perpetrator, or by others as a result of being labeled a snitch. Finally, survivors may not speak out because they fear that their report may not be kept confidential. They have little trust in staff to properly handle and investigate the situation, which is why I'm glad Erin said that about, you know, staff taking all reports seriously. They may not know how to make a report. That might also prevent them from reporting. Or they may not recognize that what has happened to them as meeting the definition of sexual abuse. And lastly, they may fear being blamed for the sexual abuse. While this can happen to any incarcerated survivor, this can be particularly common for inmates who are the most vulnerable, such as lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender inmates, or inmates who are seen as less able to defend themselves. A decision to report or not can be influenced by what they see happening to others in the facility. We're going to look at two more sets of data about what happened when someone did make a report. According to those same Bureau of Justice Statistics data collections, these were actually of former state prisoners, the facility response to reports of sexual abuse by staff showed that 46% of the reports resulted in the victim being written up. 41% of the former prisoners surveyed were moved to restrictive housing after reporting sexual abuse. And 15% of the reports resulted in no facility response at all. This graphic shows the facility response to reports of sexual abuse by other inmates. In this case, 29% of facilities wrote the victim up, 34% were moved to restrictive housing, and 37% said there was no facility response at all. Please make note that this data represents former state prisoners. The surveys were completed prior to the release of the final PREA standards. The statistics did not tease out any justification or reasoning for any of these outcomes. Also, these responses may still clearly follow the standards, specifically referencing the standard on protective custody, which allows for inmates to be placed in segregated housing only if there's a determination that no other available alternative means of separation from the likely abusers exist. If this occurs, a limit to the duration and specific procedures may be followed and documented. Even if some of these facility responses aligned with what we now know as the PREA standards, without proper training and education, these responses are easily interpreted as punitive. And I mean that by other inmates viewing what is happening and seeing it as being punitive. Keep in mind that these actions, regardless of their purpose, do not develop a reporting culture. And to ensure the sexual safety of the facility, the PREA standards aim to create a reporting culture so that people can get help, that staff take the reports and an investigation occurs, and that future sexual abuse is prevented. Here are some of the things survivors who do courageously report sexual abuse might hear. While communication with prisoners has been less during the COVID-19 pandemic, We at JDI usually receive about 200 letters and over 50 phone calls a month from survivors of sexual abuse in detention. These are all real life responses survivors have received that you see on your screen when they disclose their sexual abuse. As it was mentioned in the previous webinar on trauma-informed approaches to care, the first person a survivor tells about sexual abuse has a significant impact on their overall healing from the trauma. Keeping that in mind, imagine the impact on a survivor when they hear the following after disclosing sexual abuse. When a victim's own father says, "How could you let yourself get raped? What kind of man are you?" Or a nurse told one survivor, "Your medical kite said that you were coming down for chest pains. So you're basically telling me that you lied about a life-threatening medical condition. I'm going to need to speak to an officer about this." One investigator told a survivor, "We reviewed the videotape from that night and didn't see an officer raping you. We know you're lying. If you don't retract your statement, we'll charge you with making a false report." A survivor's cellmate told him, "Are you for real? I can't hang out with no punk. Don't say nothing about that to me again, bro." And this is what a correctional counselor suggested. "I can see from your file that you've had issues with staff at other institutions. Perhaps you'd be better off in administrative segregation so that we can keep a closer eye on you." Now, granted, this is not how all people respond, and that yes, staff are trained to take reports seriously. But when you hear these responses, it's not a surprise why victims of sexual abuse in detention may choose not to report. They need people who will believe them. They need people who will be there to support them and to help them. I will now hand things over to Lisa, who will talk with us about confidentiality and specifics about confidentiality in North Carolina. Lisa?
Thank you, Tara. But when survivors tell, they don't want information about what they experienced shared far and wide. They want to tell someone they trust, someone who can support them and help them get services they need to heal. Providing support and connecting to services is a role that corrections officials can and do play. Due to safety and security needs, the ability to keep sexual abuse confidential when it's not been reported and when the survivor does not want to report is not something correction officials can do. They need to investigate. What if the abuser continues to hurt this victim? What if the abuser is hurting others? Thankfully, the PREA standards want corrections facilities to engage in a relationship with community-based victim advocacy organizations. Not only are rape crisis advocates able to provide this support and connection to resources, they are also bound by confidentiality statutes. So North Carolina laws do not define confidential communications. However, the North Carolina General Statute 853-12 states that communication with agents of rape crisis centers and domestic violence programs are privileged. This means that the communication they have with their clients, including those in incarceration settings, are like attorney-client conversations. And that means that advocates cannot share anything that they share with others. There are some exceptions to this privileged communication. It's important for corrections officials and victim advocates to discuss what is privileged and what things would require the advocate to disclose what is shared with them. It's important for prisoners or residents or inmates to be notified about their limits to confidentiality. And this can be done during orientation and written into the inmate handbook, but it should also be something that the advocates share with these individuals when they meet with them. One of these exceptions is an advocate is told about abuse or neglect of a child or a disabled adult. North Carolina General Statute states in these situations that advocates are mandatory reporters. A judge can order that this information between the advocate and survivor be revealed. If the judge believes that the information is absolutely necessary for evidence in a civil or a criminal case, and that this would be the only way this information could be brought into the case. Now, a survivor may want an advocate to disclose information on their behalf. Well, while this communication is privileged, a survivor may waive the privilege. This requires written, informed consent, and it's described in the North Carolina General Statute 853-12B. Written informed consent must be specific and time limited. So now let's look at the PREA standard that's specific to having confidential support services. I'm going to read the part of Standard 115.53 subsection A that talks about confidentiality. It says that the facility shall enable reasonable communication between inmates and these organizations and agencies in as confidential a manner as possible. Take note about two phrases in this subsection: reasonable and as confidential a manner as possible. Over the next couple of slides, we will have greater discussion about what reasonable and as confidential a manner as possible looks like in practice. The facility must allow inmates reasonable communication with outside emotional support. This means that agencies and facilities should use existing systems for communication, as long as the confidentiality of that communication can be ensured. For example, communication through letters between survivors and emotional support service providers should receive the same level of confidentiality as legal mail does. Telephone calls should be permitted on phones to which inmates have regular access and don't need to ask permission to use. That would include things like punching in an inmate number or code that would associate with them. Telephone numbers to access confidential support services should be allowed for all prisoners, and those calls should be unmonitored and not recorded. If it is possible to provide more privacy, for example, in a medical or mental health unit, it's encouraged to use that mechanism. All right, now let's look at the communication should occur in as confidential a manner as possible. Discussions about confidentiality and any limits must be discussed between corrections officials and victim advocates before services begin. Everyone must know and be in agreement with any limits that are imposed. So if limits exist regarding confidentiality, prisoners or inmates must be informed of these exceptions or limits before they access emotional support services. This includes the extent to which such communications will be monitored and the extent to which reports of abuse will be forwarded to authorities in accordance with mandatory reporting laws. It is not enough to tell prisoners the limits to confidentiality during intake. When they contact an advocate, the limits to confidentiality must be reviewed. Allowing inmates to access services in as confidential a manner as possible. Survivors benefit from speaking openly with a trusted service provider, and lack of confidentiality can hinder open communication. I want you to think about your facility and some of the limits to confidentiality you may have when providing access to confidential support. So if you're a corrections staff, think about your facility, or if you're on the advocate side, if you can think back to either the prisons or jails or other detention facilities you work with. What are some creative ways to provide the most confidential support? What is confidentially insured when using the phone? And what about mail or kiosk? Go ahead and add any comments you might have in the chat box, and we'll just wait a few minutes on you guys to let us know how you are being creative in your access to confidential support.
We have a response universal PIN for the hotline to avoid persona identification.
Okay, yeah, so we were talking about having an identification number to use phones, making sure that there is a universal PIN to avoid that.
Normally phone calls are monitored, but they are not with victim service providers, and also using legal mail.
Right, so making sure that those phone calls that are recorded or monitored that you are allowing those victim service providers as non-recorded or unmonitored calls, and legal mail. Like we said, the privilege is just the same as legal mail. Great, thanks so much. All right, well, survivors should not be denied services simply because it's impossible for rape crisis centers to provide them with the absolute privacy that they offer in the community. It's important for corrections and victim advocates to discuss what they each mean about confidentiality and to find ways to compromise in order to provide services. But do not compromise on the point of sacrificing your mission and values or your need for safety and security. For example, the job of officials is to monitor inmates' movements within their facilities. If a rape crisis center proposes on-site counseling, negotiations must include how survivors will get to appointments and how to ensure that the names of survivors seeking services are kept as private as possible. Balancing survivors' confidentiality and officials' needs to track the location of prisoners requires thoughtful guidance. We cannot stress with you enough the help that NC CASA can provide. It'll take time to work out negotiations, and you might reach an impasse. Reach out to NC CASA for support and guidance.
Great, thank you, Lisa. And along those lines, just a reminder that towards the end, actually the very last webinar in the series, so later in July, is going to be focused on creating an MOU. So the agreement between a corrections facility and a rape crisis advocacy organization. So I encourage you to stay tuned for that as well. I'd like to welcome and introduce you to Nicole De La Torre, she, her, hers, a program director with JDI. Nicole is the project director for an Inside Line, a confidential support hotline JDI runs to provide support to prisoners in the Michigan and Vermont Department of Corrections. She is going to share about the hotline, including how they have negotiated confidentiality of the services provided. Nicole, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Nicole, I was wondering if you could tell us about the origins of the hotline and why, the reasons why the DOCs do not work with their local advocacy organizations for these hotline services.
Sure. So a couple of years ago, we received a grant from the Office for Victims of Crime to provide emotional support services to incarcerated survivors. Unfortunately, the agency we had planned to partner with on this project didn't agree to our confidentiality requirements, so we weren't able to move forward with them. Luckily for us, at the same time, the state of Michigan had put out a solicitation for a hotline for their Department of Corrections. So that's actually how we ended up working with that agency. While the Michigan Coalition operates their community hotline for the state, and they have many rape crisis centers across the country that are doing really amazing work. They don't have the capacity to provide a hotline for 30 DOC prisons. So that's kind of why we decided to support them in this way. But we're connected to the coalition, and the goal is to eventually pass the hotline along to a local organization. Similarly, we were approached at the end of last year by an advocate from the Vermont Network, which is our coalition. The Vermont Department of Corrections had experienced some pretty serious and widespread sexual abuse at one of their facilities, and they were in need of support services beyond what the local providers were able to provide. So through the state coalition, we were actually connected to the DOC and are now using that same OVC-funded hotline to support survivors in Vermont's 6 facilities. So really, at this point, for both those states, it was a capacity issue. But again, advocates in both Vermont and Michigan are doing amazing work with their local detention facilities, and we're just happy to be able to support that work through our hotline.
Thank you for that. That's really helpful to kind of see how the work that JDI is doing through this hotline, dovetails and partners or supports, like you said, the state coalitions. What are the kinds of things that callers seeking when they reach out to the hotline?
Yeah, so for the most part, callers are looking for a compassionate listener. As we know, incarcerated survivors usually have less resources in terms of support. So I'd say most of our callers are just looking for that emotional support, a safe space to talk through whatever's on their mind. We do get a few calls a month where callers are in more immediate crisis or believed to be in danger, or even callers experiencing suicidal ideation. But again, those types of calls are much less frequent. And then we do also get a number of calls of callers who are just looking for information, usually about the PREA reporting options or referrals to local organizations or even oversight agencies and legal support organizations.
Great. You know, something that I know in talking with advocates around the nation is that there's sometimes concern about, you know, they're already stretched thin in terms of their capacity and, you know, concern about how many calls they'll actually be getting through a hotline with a correctional facility. Can you give us a little bit of context? I mean, how many prisoners are in the Vermont and Michigan DOCs? And then about how many calls per month does a hotline receive?
Yeah, sure. And I should say our hotline is open Monday through Friday, 11 a.m. to 9 p.m. local time, both for Michigan and Vermont. So it's open 10 hours a day for 5 days a week. And the population of Michigan's DOC is about 41,000 right now, and Vermont is a little under 2,000. So together, we're looking at about 43,000 prisoners that have access to our line. The average number of calls we get a month right now is about 85, but to be clear, that range varies significantly. So our lowest call volume month was just 32 calls, and our highest was 193. So we've been operating the line for about 2 years, and in Vermont only since January of this year. So it's kind of hard to see any clear trends, but we can definitely say that we see an increase during the holidays. And we've also seen a significant increase during this pandemic. So, you know, clearly when people are sort of looking for support and can't, you know, maybe access their families or their regular sort of support system.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to ask you a follow-up about things since with the onset of COVID-19. But before I do that, I just want to thank you again for mentioning the number of hours that the hotline is open, because you know, 10 hours certainly meets what is required in the standards. The standards don't specify that it has to be 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Just that, you know, that people have access to confidential support services. So thank you for that. And yeah, just thinking about the pandemic, have you noticed any differences in the kinds of calls? I mean, I know you said there was a little bit of an increase in call volume, but talk to us a little bit about, you know, the kinds of calls. Is there any difference in what you've been receiving?
Yeah, and actually, I would say it's a pretty significant increase in terms of the call volume. And I want to note also that in talking to advocates across the country, it really seems to vary. Many rape crisis centers that run hotlines have seen the opposite effect. So it depends, I guess, on the measures the facility is taking and how much support survivors have otherwise. But both the systems that we've been working with have been very committed to survivors still having access to the phones to call us. And while some callers have shared that at times they have less access to the phones because they're outside of their cells less, and obviously during those times the phones are extremely busy, for the most part, survivors have been calling us regularly, and overall our numbers did go up. But in terms of the kinds of calls, I'd say I'd still categorize them as people needing emotional support, but there's definitely a strong COVID connection to a lot of our calls. Survivors are experiencing a lot of fears and anxieties around the pandemic, like a lot of us are, specifically because they've lost visitation from their families and have less access to information a lot of times. And of course, just the fact that they're living in conditions that are unsuitable for social distancing. So we've definitely seen a lot of those trends in our calls for the last couple of months.
Great, thank you. And before I ask you a few more questions, I just want to let folks that are joining us today, if you have questions for Nicole about the hotline, please feel free to go ahead and put those in the Q&A section, and we'll take a look at those and ask those of her before we transition to the next portion. So Nicole, back to you in the hotlines. I mean, what we've talked about on this webinar and on others is about the need for confidential support services. Can you talk about the importance as advocates to understand the environment where prisoners live in order to provide appropriate services?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's really important for advocates to have some understanding of the environment that prisoners are in. Of course, this isn't going to be universal, and so I encourage all advocates to connect with their partners to learn more about the specific facilities that survivors are calling from, and even take a tour if possible. Obviously, that's difficult right now as most facilities are closed to visitors, but in general, it's just a good idea to do that if you're able to, or when you're able to. I think one of the most obvious reasons that comes to mind for why knowing the environment is important is around safety planning. This will look really different in a detention facility than in the community, where survivors have really little control over their environment. And of course, they can't leave or move. So it's helpful to understand what type of living situation they're in, whether they're in a single cell, a double cell, an open dorm style housing unit, and what that means, what that looks like. I also think a lot of things about detention facilities can be really triggering. The sounds, the isolation, the shared living space, and obviously their environment really affects how survivors cope and heal from sexual trauma, especially if it's abuse that happened in that facility. So they may still have regular contact with their abuser and overall just have very little control over their day-to-day activities. I think it's also helpful to know what kind of resources are available to them so that you can make appropriate suggestions when you're thinking about coping skills and referral services to refer them to within the facility. And lastly, I'd say it's also helpful just to know the setting from where they're calling from, to know what level of privacy they may or may not have. I'm always shocked when I go into a facility and see how close together phones usually are. And I think that's really helpful understanding when folks may not feel comfortable, saying certain things on a line. I know I've had several callers who I can tell that's what's going on. And so I'll just use yes or no questions, for example, and I'll ask them if that's okay. And that way I actually get a lot of more information because I'm doing most of the talking, but it's a way for them to be able to share. So that's just helpful to know. And we actually have callers that call from outside phones, which I didn't even know was a thing because I haven't really seen those in facilities I visited. So yeah, I think just knowing where people are calling from can also be really helpful.
Great. Nicole, I have a couple more questions for you, but we have a question. Well, actually, I'm going to hold off on a question that was there, and I'll ask it to you after we go through these other questions for you. I was wondering if you could talk about the limits to confidentiality of the services that JDI provides. I mean, have there been any challenges related to like what JDI wants for confidentiality compared to what the DOCs are willing or able to provide? And how have you overcome some of these challenges?
Yeah, so I think, and I'm not super familiar. I know Lisa talked a little bit about the requirements in North Carolina, but I think ours are very similar. Our limits to confidentiality come in when we have reason to believe that someone's a threat to themselves or to others. And of course, if we're informed of any abuse that involves children, someone who's elderly or a dependent adult. But otherwise, all of our communication is completely confidential. We actually have not had any challenges to this with the current DOCs that we're working with, but as I mentioned earlier, it's actually the reason we weren't able to move forward with our original partners for this project. For us, it's not only important that correctional agencies respect our confidentiality mandate, but that they also ensure that the line being used is unmonitored and unrecorded. And I know this is sometimes a sticking point for facilities, but it is possible. And folks touched on it just a couple of minutes ago on the comments, but both Michigan and Vermont use GTL as their phone service, which I know is a really popular system in corrections, and it's just something that needs to be worked out with them, but it's totally possible. So for our hotline, as I mentioned in one of the comments earlier, we use a universal PIN that was set up by GTL so that callers can avoid using their personal PINs, which provides that anonymity that Lisa mentioned earlier. And again, that PIN also triggers the calls to be unmonitored and unrecorded. I will add, though, that in general, when confidentiality challenges arise, I think it's really important for advocates to be able to meaningfully explain how access to support services are really critical in the healing of a survivor, and that they actually can contribute to an open environment for reporting, because obviously when a survivor feels safe and supported, they're more likely to report and more likely to seek help. This is usually the challenge for facilities, is the fact that they want advocates to report abuse that we hear about that's happening in their facilities. and for good reasons, right? They want to be able to help those folks, but as advocates, we're not actually mandated reporters under PREA. And in fact, the standards call for communication with advocacy organizations to be as confidential as possible, as Lisa mentioned. So I think just knowing the relevant PREA standards can be a really helpful tool for these conversations.
Great, thank you. And like Lisa mentioned, in North Carolina, there's specific statutes, a specific statute that talks about advocates and the privileged communication between them and their clients. Can you talk about the differences between confidential support services and the reporting options that PREA requires? And what happens, and specifically, what happens if someone calls you and discloses sexual abuse that they haven't reported and they want the advocate to report on their behalf? What do you do?
Sure. So the standards do require that prisoners have multiple methods for reporting sexual abuse, and that includes an outside reporting option, which is where I think things get confusing for folks who may think that's the same thing as the outside support service. But I think you're going to go into some details about that shortly, Tara, so I'll let you go into more details about that. But basically, it's really important for advocates to know what the various options are for reporting so that they can share those with callers. As I mentioned, it's one of the main reasons people call us is for that type of information. If a caller asks us to report on their behalf, we try to just really explain the purpose of the line to them and let them know that we're not a reporting option. In Michigan, it's been a bit confusing because they have a similar hotline that's for reporting. And actually, this is one of the things we saw when we visited, which again, it's just really helpful to even see where posters are posted when you visit a facility. But our poster was right next to the reporting one. So obviously both PREA related, and there was some confusion around that. But just really explaining what the purpose of our line is and then giving them those other reporting options. But if they ask us to report in some very limited cases, we do share reports if they meet a certain criteria that we've sort of established for ourselves, which is basically if they're unable to report through any of the options because of safety or access reasons, or if they've exhausted all of their reporting options and have not gotten a response or a sufficient one from the facility, then we're able to share that with our contacts at the DOC. And that's, again, because we've been able to build a good relationship with them. But of course, we only do that in very limited cases and only with explicit consent from the survivor.
Great. We've had a couple of questions submitted, if that's okay for me to ask you now, Nicole.
Yeah, sure. And I'm also, if there's anything I can't answer right now, I'm also happy to stay on and try to get some answers by the end of the webinar.
Okay, thank you so much. So one of the questions is about asking if you can share like language that you use when someone may be having a difficult time explaining what has happened to them.
So difficult time, sorry, is that difficult time with what's happening to them in the facility?
I think that's, I'm guessing yes, or, you know, difficult time explaining what happened to them in terms of the sexual abuse. Like, do you, you know, how do you sort of work with clients on that?
Yeah, so all of the folks that answer our line are rape crisis trained, and of course, because we're offices in different cities, we all have different trainings. But you know, I think like in the community, we use a lot of the same skills. So you know, validation, again, just listening. In terms of explaining what happened to them, I'm not sure I fully understand that part of the question, but yeah, I mean, I would say that in terms of the validation and the way that we communicate with folks, it's very similar to the type of counseling that you would provide for someone in the community. I think the only difference would be in terms of coping skills and safety planning, but just, you know, reminding them that what happened to them is not okay. I think a lot of times in detention, because of the power dynamics that folks might experience, and again, this is in the community too, guilt and shame and all of those feelings that come with sexual trauma. So, you know, that's something that we always work on with people is making sure that they know that nothing that happened to them is their fault. So yeah, again, I don't know if that's helpful, but just similar to what we would do with folks in the community.
Great. And to piggyback off of that, I mean, can you talk, give an example of walking someone through a crisis situation. When you're talking with them over the phone in a confinement setting and they're not in a safe place, like similar to what you were describing, like they're calling from one of those banks of phones that are right next to each other. What would you do?
Yeah, I mean, if someone's in a crisis, a lot of times folks that are in crisis, we try to just help them with grounding techniques. We do things that they can do right then and there. So again, just given the setting, a lot of times that's just breathing, which really, really helps for folks to calm down. Letting them know that that what's going on for them matters, that we're here for them, making sure that again, this is just a side note, but at least in Michigan and in Vermont, actually not Vermont, sorry, in Michigan, the call limits are a big issue. They only have 15 minutes. So that's one thing that even though we have a universal PIN, they're still restricted by that 15-minute call. So we don't have a whole lot of time to do this, but yeah, just using some grounding skills for them. Safety planning usually involves them calling us back so that we can check in. Yeah, just the sort of listening is usually the most helpful, but yeah, sharing, like even just doing the breathing with them and sharing some coping skills that they can meaningfully do, in their setting.
Great, thank you for that. And in terms of clarification on that previous question, I think the idea was, maybe they're unable to sort of like explain in great detail because of, inability to, because they may be next to someone else who's also on the phone. Is that a situation where you would use the yes/no questions?
Yes.
Like you were doing?
Yeah, and I can do an example of that. I mean, I had one recently where the person was just really quiet, and I think they even maybe said that they couldn't say what they wanted to say right now. And so I just asked, I said, this is an emotional support line for survivors of sexual abuse and harassment. Is that what you're calling about? And they said, yes. And I think before that, of course, I asked, is it okay if I ask you some yes or no questions? And then going from there, like, is it abuse that happened in the facility? Is it abuse that you're still experiencing? Would you like me to share some, reporting information with you? Would it be helpful for me to send you information in the mail? So yeah, making it easier for them to be able to answer or to share with us what's going on without really having to share. And that's something I actually should have mentioned earlier too. We have survivors that call just to get information about how they can correspond with us, and they feel safer writing to us. That's not always the case, because of course there's some mistrust in how the mail is being handled as well sometimes, but sometimes they feel more comfortable writing to us, especially when they don't have privacy around the phones. So that's also something that we provide.
That's great. Thank you so much. Thank you. This has been tremendously helpful. And as someone mentioned in the chat that they love questions, love things where you talk about advocacy skills. And I think you've really given a lot of great context and real life examples for how advocates who are used to working with clients in the community can take the skills and knowledge that they have and transfer those to a confinement setting. So thank you again, Nicole, for joining us today. And thank you too for all the work that you do to provide services to incarcerated survivors. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. It was great being on, and I'll stick around in case there's other questions I can help with.
Wonderful. Thank you. So I'm going to now hand things back over to Lisa.
All right. Thank you, Tara. Thanks again, Nicole. That was really helpful. I'm really glad you got a chance to touch on those yes or no questions. I know there's really not a facility that I can think of that I've ever been in where the phones weren't either all on the same wall or in a phone tree setting. So I think understanding that limitation to confidentiality is a really good start for a lot of advocates. All right, so to close out today's webinar, we're going to focus on the PREA reporting standards. There are multiple options, and the details of each option are sometimes confusing, so we want to clearly outline what's required by each standard. We'll then look at all of them in relation to the work of victim advocates and how they play into these standards. So remember, the PREA standards apply to all confinement facilities, adult prisons and jails, juvenile facilities, community confinement facilities, and lockups. And while there are victim service standards, it's not the responsibility of the victim service agencies to comply. Rather, it's the responsibility of the corrections facilities to work with their local advocacy agency and to build a relationship and work collaboratively to find ways to work together to provide services to incarcerated survivors. We'll discuss the agreements with community service providers more during the final webinar in the series, focused on establishing memorandum of understanding. So as we talked about in the PREA 101 webinar, victims advocates can provide multiple services to incarcerated survivors of sexual abuse, including accompaniment at the forensic medical exam, accompaniment at investigatory interviews, confidential follow-up services, and confidential emotional support services via phone and/or mail. NC CASA has a free brochure that agencies may use describing what victim advocacy is for anyone who wants to learn more. Advocates want to help, and many of them will be able to work with their jail partners to provide these services and possibly more. But sometimes there are limits to their capacity to do all the things that are required by the standards. Don't worry, NC CASA is here to help. Whether you're a jail or other corrections facility or an advocacy organization, not sure how they can help, contact NC CASA for assistance. With that quick refresher on PREA compliance and service from victim advocates, we'll now review the PREA reporting standards and what role victim advocates play. The relevant PREA standards for reporting include 11551, inmate reporting, and 11554, third-party reporting. As we discussed today, Standard 11553, inmate access to outside confidential support services, is specific to the work of victim advocates. A quick note about terminology. The standards sometimes use agency, while other times they use facility. This is deliberate and reflects the responsibility of who has to ensure something happens. While most jails in North Carolina are only one facility, meaning the agency and facility are the same, we'll use the language of the standards since it is more specific. The purpose of Standard 11551 is to ensure that inmates and staff have multiple internal ways to report sexual abuse and sexual harassment. The options will vary by facility, but they can include by phone, kiosk, letter, grievance, or telling any staff, contractor, or volunteer. These reporting options are also available to report retaliation for making a report or cooperating during a sexual abuse investigation. They are also an avenue for reporting any staff neglect and that may have resulted in the sexual abuse in the first place. Agencies must also provide at least one option outside the agency to report. So this option has to be completely separate from the agency. This requirement exists in cases where the survivor does not trust any of the internal options and can still make a report. It's critical that the external reporting option that you have, excuse me, my apologies. It's critical that the external reporting option that you have be outside the reporting at the agency to report. So the option has to be completely separate from the agency. This requirement exists in cases where the survivor doesn't trust any internal options and can still make a report. And the external option has agreed to receive these reports and also share the information back to the facility so an investigation can occur. So whether using the internal or external option, survivors are allowed to remain anonymous. The external reporting is not the same as confidential support services from Standard 11553. I want to note this because it's a common misunderstanding, and community-based victim advocacy organizations are sometimes asked to serve as the external reporting option. Remember that North Carolina General Statute and the communications between advocates and survivors is privileged. Because the communication is privileged, victims' advocates cannot be the external reporting option of sexual abuse and sexual harassment. Even without this statute, the majority of advocacy organizations will refuse to do this, as it's a conflict with their mission and may be prohibited based on the funding they receive. I know not everyone may be from North Carolina, but there's also guidance from the Department of Justice that also supports that generally it is not okay for victim advocacy organizations to serve as external reporting entities. So this frequently asked question can be found on the National PREA Resource Center website. And you can look in more detail to see what the PREA Resource Center advises. So now I want to find out what jails are doing in North Carolina for external reporting. We're going to take another poll to see what's being used. It's okay if you don't know. If you selected other, try to write out in the chat box what you do use that's defined as other.
Great, it looks like we have about 26 of 41 people have responded. So I will give it another 30 seconds. And it says that some people don't have the poll showing up for them. So if you would like, you can definitely type in the number to all panelists and we'll make sure to include you in there. Right, so I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. So local law enforcement connected to the jail, 19%, other law enforcement, 6%, Rape Crisis Center or SADV Center, 19%, other advocacy related organization, 13%, do not know, 48%, other, 0%.
Okay, so not to be confused with outside reporting entities, the PREA standards have a separate standard for third-party reports. So this means that someone can make a report of sexual abuse and sexual harassment on behalf of an inmate victim. This could be a friend, a family member, or really anyone that the inmate discloses to. The agency has to not only accept third-party reports, they also have to make this information publicly available. This is most often posted on the agency website, but it is also recommended that it be posted in the facility lobbies and other visitation areas. And just like with the external reporting option, victim advocates are not going to be third-party reporters. Yes, it is possible that survivors will give written, informed consent for an advocate to disclose sexual abuse on their behalf, but this is not something that advocates want to do. Instead, they want to provide information to survivors so that they are empowered to make a report on their own. So now let's contrast the reporting standards with Standard 115.53, Inmate Access to Confidential Support Services. So you might remember that this standard aims to provide all inmates with access to emotional support services from outside the facility to help heal from trauma. It's important to note that access to these services is not limited to individuals who are sexually abused in confinement. Rather, the intent of this standard is to provide services to anyone who may need them. Access to outside support is important because inmates may be reluctant to seek emotional support from within a facility, and some facilities may lack resources to provide counseling services. A victim will most benefit from a trained support person who can provide a safe environment for discussing issues related to sexual abuse in as confidential a manner as possible. So we've talked about these three standards separately, but now I want to bring them together to summarize and to compare and contrast their requirements, including the role of victims advocates in each. Two of the standards focus on reporting, so external and third-party reporting. I often hear people refer to third-party reporting when they actually mean external reporting. So just to clarify, external reporting is an entity outside of the correctional agency that has agreed to accept reports of sexual abuse. This is primarily a reporting option for inmates, but staff can use it too. This is not a role for victim advocacy organizations. Advocacy organizations that are asked to serve in this capacity can politely decline and offer confidential support services instead. Don't forget, NC CASA is here to help you and negotiate the services you provide to incarcerated survivors. And please, please, I know we've added some links in the webinar chat to look at some of the documents and resources, and by all means take advantage of those. Third-party reporting is for a friend or a family member or a loved one to report on someone else's behalf. Like the previous standard, that again is not a role for advocates. Like I've mentioned, the place for advocates is with the confidential support services standard. These are for all inmates and are not just to support survivors, but also a source of information so survivors can make decisions about what is best for them and their healing. While being a reporting option is not a service advocates in North Carolina can provide, it's very important for advocates to know what the reporting options are so that they can tell survivors about them and situations where someone has not reported and wants to know more. A link to a more detailed comparison can be found in the chat box and will be posted on the NC CASA website. It explains the intent of each of the standards and who's responsible for doing what. And I noticed we did get a comment about what advocates should be doing and the relationship. And again, we will go more into detail about this relationship too during our webinar regarding MOUs, if that helps with anyone. All right, so if we have any questions, feel free, you can put them in the Q&A. If you have trouble, I know some people had some issues with the Q&A box, you're more than welcome to put in the chat box and we can go over those. If you have any questions for Nicole, again, you can always put those in the chat box as well.
So it looks like we have a question. Are there newer statistics to compare to the 2011 stat on the number or percentage of incarcerated individuals that report sexual abuse since the PREA standards were enacted?
Yeah, I can take that one, Gabriella. So unfortunately, the answer is sort of. And the reason I say that is, so the PREA statute, when it came out, the legislation required that data collection be done. As you can imagine, these surveys are very time consuming and expensive. And so for adult prisons and jails, the last time they did data collection and released reports are on those statistics that we've been showing throughout the webinar series. They are currently in the process of new data collection. And what's interesting is that previously it was prisons and jails were lumped together. In the new data collection that's being done, there is separate data and separate surveys for prisons and for jails. So we'll have new information probably in the next couple of years. The reason I said maybe is because in 2019, they also did data data collection on juvenile detention facilities. So we do have updated information for juvenile detention facilities that was released about August of last year, August, September. And in fact, I was just notified that there in the coming, later this year, there'll be additional reports with further analysis of that data. And so anyways, the one thing I want to say is that for anyone that watched the PREA 101 webinar, we did talk about this then. But what we are seeing is that there was about a 30% reduction in the incidence of sexual abuse in juvenile confinement facilities. So in the previous surveys, which again was around 2012, it was about 10%, and now it's dropped to about 7%. So it's still a problem. It's still way too much. Even one incident is too much, but we have seen a decrease. So I am cautiously optimistic that we'll see a similar trend with the new prison and jail surveys that are coming out. I have a question that someone asked me earlier this week that I thought might be good for Nicole. You talked about this a little bit, Nicole, in your remarks, but I wonder if you could give an example. What if you have a client that discloses that they plan to hurt themselves or someone else during a call, and that they have a means and a plan to follow through? What do you do then with that information?
Yeah, and I'm glad you said the point about that they have a means and plans to do it, because we definitely do a just brief assessment, because again, and all of you know this, but just to be clear that, folks might be experiencing suicidal ideation, but may not necessarily be suicidal. So if we determine that this person is in danger of hurting themselves or someone else, we, with both agencies, have a contact that we're supposed to notify in emergencies such as these, and we have sort of a, oh God, what is the word I'm looking for? Like not a flow chart, but just an order of, like, if the main contact isn't available, then we call this person. If that person isn't available, then we go straight to the facility, frankly. Again, because these are big systems that we're working with, our first line is to reach out to the agency PREA coordinator. But if that person's not there, then it's an analyst. If that person doesn't answer, then we go straight to the facility. But I think that's a really important thing to talk about with any facility or agency that you're working with, is what that process should look like. Fortunately, I think we've only had to do that once or twice. But, yeah.
Great, thank you for sharing that, Nicole. It's really helpful information for folks. Do we have any other questions?
We did have one question. What if a survivor that we talk with over the phone or via letter wants us to disclose information on their behalf and we cannot get a written consent? What can we do instead? What is allowable in North Carolina?
Sure. Lisa, is that something that you have information about what can be done instead, or what is allowable in North Carolina?
Well, it is something where it is, like we said, in the general statute requires written consent, and it has to be time specific, and who is getting that information needs to be released. So it would be something that would have to be sent to the inmate. They would have to sign it, and you would have to get it in order to allow for that. So in cases like that, I would really emphasize your limitations as an advocate as to what you can do. And then also try to educate and inform that survivor on ways that they can report, the ways they can report confidentially in that facility, and also give them opportunities that they can disclose to someone else for that third-party reporting, where it might be a trusted friend or a family member that could do that for them. But in North Carolina, we cannot disclose any of the survivor's information without written consent.
Thank you for that, Lisa. And I know that right now with COVID-19, and as it was mentioned, there aren't visitors allowed into facilities. I've also heard of jurisdictions where when advocates are allowed to go and meet in person or to hold groups, that they often will carry some of those informed consent forms with them in the case that they, talk with someone and, a situation like this should occur, or to follow up with someone they may have met over the phone. So those are other options, but unfortunately that is not a possibility while visitation is prohibited at facilities.
It looks like we have another question. What if a client discloses they plan to hurt themselves or someone else and have a means and a plan to follow through? What do we do with this information?
Yeah, and that goes to what Nicole was speaking to before about having a plan and a process for triaging, doing a screening of those clients, and then having she talked about having the mechanisms to reach out to people at the agency, and if someone isn't available, who do they go to next? And again, having that be part of the discussion through the MOU process. So those kinds of situations, should they arise, which Nicole said in 2 years of running the hotline, it's only happened a couple of times, thankfully, but that there is a process in place should an advocate need to do that.
And Tara, can I add something real quick?
Of course.
I also just want to add that I think the assessment piece is so important. I think especially in corrections where folks are already so isolated, especially during hard times like the one we're going through now, that people experience, and as we know that a lot of incarcerated people have very serious trauma, that suicidal ideation is not that uncommon, unfortunately. So I think the assessment is especially important when we're working with survivors in detention, because what we know usually happens if someone is deemed to be a threat to themselves is that they are put in solitary confinement. And some facilities call it something different, but essentially in very extreme sort of isolation, and are, in a lot of places in a cell that's sort of like padded with very little clothes and just like a safety vest. So, it can mean a lot more in detention to say that someone's suicidal, and the effects could be really further sort of traumatizing. So I just want to emphasize that it's really important that that assessment be done to ensure that the person really does need help, and it's not to minimize suicidal ideation, but I just wanted to make that distinction.
And
great, thank you for that.
Tara, if I could just add specifically to North Carolina, and definitely to jails, they're all required to have mental health staff that is absolutely 100% free to all inmates in that facility, and it is part of our jail standards. So that is something that they are going to provide, and again with that MOU, understanding who that person is, how they can request that support within the facility, and where they can go. And I want to also mention that NC CASA, if you have any trouble with adapting kind of what you do in the community already on your support lines, on your hotlines, to a facility support, that's something, if you have questions about adapting that and what roles you need to play as an advocate, please don't hesitate to contact NC CASA, and they can help you walk through it and find a process that works best for your agency.
Great, thank you, Lisa. Unless do we have any more questions, Gabriella? If not, I'll go ahead and talk through some of the resources that we've provided for people today.
It looks like that is all the questions we have.
Wonderful, thank you. So I just want to walk through a few resources, like I said. The first one is Hope Behind Bars. I know we've shared this on all the webinars to date. It is a great resource for advocates in your work to support survivors of sexual abuse in detention. So I encourage you to take a look at that resource. These are also just some other resources. So some of them you will see already have links to NC CASA's website, specifically the North Carolina approach, with which Lisa helped to co-write with NC CASA to help advocates and jails working together collaboratively, as well as the NC CASA brochure that she mentioned earlier in the webinar. Just to kind of reiterate, I know we posted into the chat a document that talks about the differences between external reporting, third party, and confidential. JDI also has a document, a fact sheet about this that you can access on our website if you'd like. And then also to what Lisa was saying about frequently asked questions that are available through the National PREA Resource Center. This is interpretive guidance to the PREA standards from a Department of Justice PREA working group. So these are resources there. You can always go to the PREA Resource Center's website to the FAQ page, and you can search by keyword, by standard, and it will pull up the relevant FAQs for you there. And the last two things I wanted to share, also resources on the National PREA Resource Center. They do different, so one, they do a power hour. These are webinars where they have different experts come on and talk about things. They recently had a power hour on the confidential support services standard that I thought was really well done. So I encourage you to check that out if you want to learn more. And then also there is a series of staff training resources available on the PREA Resource Center website that JDI developed in collaboration with the PREA Resource Center. And we call them PREA refreshers. They're just one page, really useful education materials for staff in confinement settings for how to do their jobs. And one of them is about encouraging inmates to report sexual abuse. So I provided that link for you as well. And we do also have them, the link I provided is for formatted for prisons and jails. There's also one for community confinement and also juvenile detention facilities. And then lastly, before I turn it over to Gabriella to close us out today, I just wanted to again point you to JDI's website. Nicole, as you all heard, is a fantastic resource, and you can reach her by, you can reach out at advocate@justdetention.org, or you can visit our website to learn more about us as an organization. We also have the ability to provide technical assistance. So, NC CASA is a tremendous resource. We are also there to help you in the work that you're doing. So you can always reach out to us for additional assistance. And with that, I'll hand it over to Gabriella to close us out.
Thank you everyone for joining us, and we hope to see you back next week. You can contact Robin Colbert, who is our Associate Director, and Courtney Dunkerton, our Anti-Human Trafficking Specialist. They can help you with any PREA questions that you have, and their emails are located on the screen. Just a reminder, for every single webinar that you attend with NC CASA, you will get a certificate for at the end of the month. So make sure to look out for an email from training@NC CASA to register for a certificate for attending this webinar. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to see you at our next Unpacking PREA webinars. I hope you all have a great day. Bye.